Hey there. Have you ever clocked out of work and thought, wait, am I really an employee or am I more like a contractor? I mean, that line can get really blurry sometimes, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Well, today's deep dive is going to tackle that exact question through a Philippine Supreme Court case that, well, it kind of went viral. Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry. Get ready, because this one goes all the way to the top.
This case is a great example of, how a typical labor dispute can turn into this huge legal battle, bringing up all these important questions about job contracting that affect, workers and companies all over the Philippines.
Yeah, we're talking about GR No 231579 and 231636 decided on June 16th, 2021. So we've got Ronald Martinez and 27 other workers, all part of the sanitation crew at this Magnolia Poultry Processing Plant, which is now San Miguel Foods Inc. That's SMFI-MPPP. They're saying they were illegally dismissed, but it's not as straightforward as it sounds.
It's more complicated than that.
Right.
They were hired through a contractor, Romac Services Trading Co. Inc. And the workers are saying that, well, Romac was just a front, basically a labor-only contractor, and that their real employer was SMFI-MPPP all along. So when the plant decided to outsource its sanitation services, these workers felt like they were unfairly let go.
Okay, so it's kind of like a he said, she said situation, but, with a whole company, a contractor, and a bunch of workers all caught in the middle. So what happened when this went to court? Did anyone even believe the workers' side of the story?
Well, at first, yeah, they did. The Labor Arbiter actually ruled in favor of the workers. They said Romac was a labor-only contractor and that SMFI-MPPP was responsible. That meant SMFI-MPPP would have to deal with the consequences of, illegally dismissing them, back wages, the whole nine
It's
yards.
like a win for the sanitation crew, at least for a little while.
Yeah, well, it was short-lived, unfortunately. The case got appealed to the NLRC, and they basically overturned the whole thing. They said, nope, Romac is a legitimate labor contractor. These workers were just contractual employees. That's it.
Whoa, so that's a huge plot twist. So things are looking pretty good for SMFI and PPP and Romac at that point, right?
Well, you'd think so, but the workers didn't give up. They took it up another level to the Court of Appeals, and guess what?
Yeah.
The Court of Appeals sided with the workers again. They went back to that original decision, saying that Romac was a labor-only contractor after all.
Wow, this is getting intense. So they were really trying to figure out if Romac actually had real control over those workers and their work, or if it was all just a facade.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting because SMFI-MPPP decides to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
Now, the highest court in the Philippines has to weigh in on who's really calling the shots and what this means for job contracting across the country.
All right, so this is it, the final showdown. What were the main arguments that SMFI and PPP brought to the Supreme Court? They must have had a pretty strong case to appeal it this far.
Oh, they did. They came in swinging, arguing that Romac was totally legit, a legitimate contractor with their own capital and investments. They pointed to Romac's registered capital stock, the fact that they owned assets like an office building and vehicles, and that they had contracts with other big companies, not just SMFI and PPP. Basically, they were trying to prove that Romac wasn't just, some fly-by-night operation.
So SMFI and PPP really wanted to show that Romac had their own separate business, that they weren't just an extension of SMFI and PPP. Did the Supreme Court buy it?
Well, they definitely considered it, but they also had to look at how things were actually working, on the ground. And that's where the famous fourfold test comes in. It's how Philippine law figures out if there's a real employer-employee relationship.
Okay, so let's break down this fourfold test. What exactly are we looking at here?
It looks at four main things. Who's doing the hiring and firing? Who's paying the wages? Who has the power to discipline? And the most important part, who's controlling how the work gets done? The Supreme Court basically had to go through all the evidence and apply this test to figure out the relationship between Romac, the workers, and SMFI and PPP.
Sounds like a legal detective story. What did they find when they started digging into these factors?
Well, starting with hiring, the evidence pointed to Romac. There were appointment letters, contracts, all on Romac letterhead, showing that they were the ones bringing those workers on board.
So far, so good for Romac. What about the money? Who was actually paying those workers?
The contracts clearly stated that Romac was responsible for, salaries and benefits, and, the evidence, including the pay slips, which had Romac's name on them, backed that up.
Okay, so 2 points for Romac. Do they also have the power to, discipline or even fire these workers?
This is where it gets interesting. There were actual documented instances where Romac exercised their disciplinary power. They suspended a worker named Benedicto Miranda for negligence and another worker, Bienvenido Milan, for punching in someone else's time card. And after his suspension, Milan was even told to report to the Romac corporate office, not SMFI-MPPP.
Wow, so they weren't just sitting back and letting SMFI-MPPP make all the decisions. It really seems like Romac was actively managing these workers.
Exactly, but remember, we're only on the third part of the fourfold test. The big one, the control over how the work is done, is still to come, and that's where things can get a little tricky.
All right, I'm hooked. What did the Supreme Court find when they looked at the control element? Who was really in charge of how those sanitation tasks were being carried out?
Well, this is where SMFI-MPPP tried to make their case. They argued that because they required the workers to attend, like seminars on poultry operations and sanitation, that they were exerting control. But the Supreme Court wasn't convinced.
Hold on, why wouldn't those seminars count as SMFI-MPPP controlling the workers?
The court recognized that, in the food industry, especially when you're dealing with poultry processing, sanitation is super important, like absolutely critical. Those seminars weren't about controlling the workers' every move. They were about making sure everyone was up to speed on food safety regulations, to protect public health.
Oh, I see. So it was more about compliance and less about SMFI-MPPP trying to micromanage them. That makes sense.
Right. And when the court looked deeper, they found that Romac actually had their own supervisors on site, like a guy named Licerio Araza. He was the one handling schedules, attendance, and overseeing the actual tasks.
So even though they were working at the SMFI-MPPP plant, those workers were ultimately answering to Romac's people, not SMFI-MPPP management. That seems pretty significant.
It is. And, all of this evidence together led the Supreme Court to conclude that, based on that fourfold test, Romac was really exercising control over how the work was done, the means, and the methods.
Okay, so the Supreme Court's leaning towards Romac being legitimate. But we've only just scratched the surface here. What other evidence did they look at?
Well, they considered the fact that Romac wasn't just working for SMFI and PPP, they had other clients too. That suggests they were running a real independent business.
Right, it wasn't like Romac was created just to provide workers for SMFI and PPP. Having multiple clients makes them seem more like a separate entity.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court even brought up a previous case that involved SMFI and PPP, but with a different contractor. They ruled in that contractor's favor, partly because they had a variety of clients.
So having diverse clients can be a big indicator that a contractor is legit, not just a front.
Exactly. The Supreme Court was looking for signs that the contractor could actually operate on their own with their own resources and structure, which is a key part of, legitimate job contracting.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got the results from the fourfold test, Romac substantial capital, that DOA certification, and now their diverse clientele. It sounds like a lot of evidence pointing towards them being legitimate. So what was the Supreme Court's final verdict? What did they decide after weighing all of this?
Well, in a decision that really shook things up in Philippine labor law, the Supreme Court actually overturned the Court of Appeals and sided with SMFI-MPPP.
Wow. So even after the workers seemed like they were, gaining some ground, the Supreme Court actually went in favor of the company and the contractor. That's surprising. What was their reasoning for such a big reversal?
They really emphasize those key factors that we've been talking about. Romac's substantial capital, their services to multiple clients, and that all-important control element that we see in the fourfold test. The court really wanted to drive home the point that Romac wasn't just like an extension of SMFI and PPP, but a totally separate, functioning business.
This case really highlights how important it is to really look closely at these relationships and not just assume everything is what it seems. It's not enough to just call something contracting and think that's the end of it.
Exactly. The Supreme Court was sending a message, that what really matters is the actual relationship, not just what you call it. They wanted to see real independence, not just the appearance of it.
So after this whole legal roller coaster ride, what happened to the workers who filed the complaint in the first place? Did they get any kind of resolution?
Unfortunately, the Supreme Court's decision meant that their claim of illegal dismissal against SMFI and PPP couldn't really hold up. Because the court recognized Romac as their actual employer, SMFI and PPP was off the hook.
So what were the workers left with? Were they just, out of the job with no options?
The court did mention that Romac had offered these workers reassignments to their other clients when the contract with SMFI-MPPP ended.
Oh, okay. Did they take them up on that offer? That seems like a reasonable solution given the situation.
Sadly, they didn't. They declined the reassignments because they were convinced they were regular employees of SMFI-MPPP, a belief that the Supreme Court ultimately rejected.
Oh, that's tough. So they ended up losing their jobs at the plant and missed out on other potential jobs because they were hoping to be recognized as regular employees.
It's a hard lesson, It shows that even when a case brings up important issues, the outcome doesn't always work out for everyone involved.
This Martinez v. Magnolia poultry case really shows just how complicated and, honestly, how risky these labor disputes can be. It's not just about, legal technicalities. It's about people's livelihoods.
I totally agree. It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, but at the end of the day, there are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions.
For our listeners who might be thinking, why should I care about a poultry plant and some sanitation workers? Mate, what's the bigger takeaway here? Why is this case important beyond the specific people involved?
What's fascinating is how this seemingly isolated case actually points to a much bigger issue, the rise of, non-standard employment arrangements, like contracting, subcontracting, outsourcing. We're seeing this trend not only in the Philippines, but all over the world.
And as these types of work arrangements become more common, so do the concerns about job security, fair wages and good benefits for workers.
Exactly. Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry really brings those concerns to the forefront. It makes us think about the potential downsides of these flexible work models and ask some tough questions about, how we can ensure fairness and protection for workers in this changing world of work.
So for companies out there who rely on contractors,
Mhm.
what's the big lesson they should learn from this case? What should they be paying attention to?
The main thing is to be careful to make sure their contracting arrangements are truly legitimate and follow the law. Companies need to understand those key differences between, genuine job contracting and labor-only contracting, and they have to structure their relationships accordingly.
Due diligence is key, right? It's not enough to just assume everything's fine. Companies need to be proactive about making sure they're not doing anything that could be seen as illegal or taking advantage of workers.
Absolutely. Things like thoroughly vetting contractors, making sure they have their own capital and independence, and having clear contracts are all super important.
And what about from the worker's point of view? What should they be aware of, especially if they're being hired through a contractor?
For workers, it's all about being informed. They need to understand their rights, pay attention to their work conditions, and know the difference between being a contractual employee of a contractor versus a regular employee of a company.
So basically, workers should be empowered to understand their employment status, know the protections that come with it, and speak up if something seems off.
Exactly. And they shouldn't hesitate to reach out to, labor organizations or get legal advice if they have any doubts or concerns.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry really highlights the importance of both workers and companies being informed and proactive when it comes to these arrangements.
Definitely. It also shows how important unions and labor groups are, for supporting workers and fighting for their rights in this increasingly complex job market.
This case really shows that we need ongoing conversations and collaboration between employers, workers, policymakers, and, even organizations to make sure we're creating a work environment that's fair, just, and sustainable for everyone.
I agree. It's not about pointing fingers at businesses or trying to stop innovation. It's about finding ways to balance flexibility and efficiency for companies while also protecting the rights and well-being of workers.
It's a challenge for sure, but cases like Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry can be really valuable learning experiences. They can push us towards solutions that are more equitable for everyone.
They can be, catalysts for positive change if we're willing to have these important conversations. Now, we've been focusing on the legal side of this case, but I think it also brings up some bigger societal questions that we should be thinking about.
You're right, there's a bigger picture here. What are some of the broader implications of this case, beyond just the legal stuff?
Well, we talked about the rise of these non-standard forms of employment, but I think we also need to consider how technology is changing the way we work. Are our laws and regulations keeping up with all these rapid changes?
That's a really good point. We have things like platform work, the gig economy, remote work, all these new ways of working that don't really fit into the traditional categories of employment. So how do we make sure workers are protected in these new landscapes?
Exactly. It's a question that requires a lot of thought and collaboration from everyone involved. We need to be creative and figure out how to adapt our legal and regulatory systems so that workers are protected while we also encourage innovation and economic growth.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure. And cases like Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry really show how important it is to stay informed and engaged in these conversations as the future of work, keeps evolving.
Absolutely. These aren't just like theoretical legal debates. They have real-world consequences for people's lives and how well our economy functions overall.
I couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's something that struck me when we were talking about that fourfold test, specifically that control element. It seems like it could be a really gray area.
You've hit on a crucial point there. Figuring out who actually controls how the work gets done is often the biggest issue in these disputes, and it can be very nuanced.
For example, if someone's working remotely, how do we assess that control element when the worker has so much more autonomy over their work environment and their schedule?
That's a great question, and it's something that courts are dealing with more and more. The traditional ways of figuring out control might need to change as the nature of work itself changes.
It seems like there's a chance that the fourfold test could be misinterpreted or even manipulated as these new work models emerge.
There is. And that's why cases like Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry are so important. They force us to re-examine these legal frameworks and make sure they can handle the complexities of the modern workplace.
It really emphasizes how we need to constantly interpret and adapt these legal ideas as the world of work keeps changing. What stands out to you at this case, and what should our listeners take away from it?
You know what really stands out to me? It's how this case really relies on those classic legal doctrines, the kind you see in law school textbooks. But we rarely see them play out in such a huge case.
That's true. It's like we're getting this behind-the-scenes look at how these big legal concepts actually work in the real world. So what are some of those key doctrines our listeners should know about?
Well, first off, we've got this thing called the presumption of regularity in, the performance of official duty.
Okay, that sounds pretty formal. What does that even mean? Like in plain English?
Basically, it means that the court assumes that government officials and agencies are doing their jobs the right way, lawfully, unless there's really strong evidence proving otherwise.
So like in this case, the fact that Daylily had certified Romac as a legitimate contractor was a point in Romac's favor because, well, theoretically, the DLE is supposed to have done their homework before giving out that certification, right?
Exactly. And you see this principle come up all the time in cases that deal with administrative law.
Got it. So it's not just about blindly trusting the authorities, but it sets a standard for how we approach legal challenges. So what's another important doctrine that's at play here?
Well, we definitely can't forget about the fourfold test, which, we've been talking about this whole time.
Right. That's the big one for figuring out if there's a real employer-employee relationship.
Yeah.
And it's especially crucial in cases like this, where you're trying to tell the difference between legitimate job contracting and those tricky labor-only contracting schemes.
It's like the ultimate test in these situations, and you'll see it mentioned a lot in labor law cases in the Philippines.
Okay, so we've got the presumption of regularity and the fourfold test. Anything else our listeners should add to their legal dictionary?
One more. Management prerogative.
Oh, yeah, that's the company's right to make decisions about how they run their business, right?
Exactly. It basically acknowledges that management gets to decide things like, who to hire, who to fire, and, yep, even contracting out services.
And in this Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry case, the Supreme Court agreed with SMFI-MPPP's right to contract out those sanitation services, right?
They did. But, and this is important, that right isn't a free pass. It can't be used as an excuse to break the law or ignore workers' rights.
There's like a balancing act. Companies have the freedom to run their businesses, but those decisions can't step on fairness and, legal rules.
Exactly. And the courts are there to make sure things stay balanced.
It's so interesting how this case brings all these legal principles together and shows us how they actually play out in a real dispute. It's like those abstract ideas suddenly become real with actual people and consequences.
It's like watching a courtroom drama unfold, but in real life, with all the twists and turns and the high stakes.
Absolutely. And for those listeners who are on the edge of their seats wanting more, We'll definitely put links to the full Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry decision and some other helpful resources in our show notes.
Yeah, good idea. That way they can really dive in and explore the legal details of this case themselves.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. We started with a simple question: are you an employee or a contractor? And ended up exploring a landmark Supreme Court decision, legal doctrines, and, the changing world of work.
We really broke down the evidence, the legal arguments, and the bigger picture implications of Martinez v. Magnolia Poultry. It's a case that reminds us to really understand our rights, be aware of the complexities of the job market, and, participate in these conversations about the future of work. So true. A big thank you to you, our expert, for taking us through this complex case. It was so clear and insightful.
It was my pleasure. I always enjoy getting into these fascinating legal discussions.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your curiosity and engagement are what make this show so great. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this episode.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those legal minds sharp.